I'm currently reviewing his most recent book, Hero of the Air, Glenn Curtiss and the Birth of Naval Aviation, for an academic journal. And it is every bit as good as his other work. My glowing assessments of Professor Trimble's scholarship are not alone. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics awarded his book, Jerome C. Hunsaker and the Rise of American Aeronautics, its Gardner-Lasser Award in 2003 for the best book in the history of aeronautics over a 5-year period. In 2011, he won the Admiral Arthur W. Radford Award for Excellence in Naval Aviation History and Literature from the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation. Professor Trimble is also the author of High Frontier, A History of Aeronautics in Pennsylvania, Wings for the Navy, A History of the Naval Aircraft Factory, and Attack from the Sea, A History of the U.S. Navy's Seaplane Striking Force. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bill Trimble.
Make some adjustments here, if you don't mind. Thank you very much, Bill. That was very kind, and it's certainly a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with this group today. And I especially want to thank the United States Naval Institute and the Naval Institute Press especially, too, for indulging some of my research and writing over the years. And I'm not sure they've made a whole lot of money on my books, but it certainly has been very pleasurable for me to work with them, a very professional group. What I want to talk about today is essentially the integration of new technology into the Navy. And of course, what we're talking about is aviation into the Navy. And what I want to do is look at some of the background to this, look at some of the very early developments, and take it through, just generally take it through World War I up to about 1919. And it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that this was not easy. What we're talking about here is something that was very complicated, something that took a good deal of time. And it's also something that's not linear. You tend to think about the relationship of a technology to a culture. And we've talked a lot here about aviation culture, and John Lehman's got an article in the latest proceedings about the end of aviation culture. We're really talking about a culture here. And the relationship between that technology and that culture is not linear. You tend to think, okay, there are various institutional and cultural ingredients here that then dictate what the technology is going to be, or conversely, what the technology is going to do in terms of how it's going to affect the culture. And as you get into this and see how complicated it is, you're going to see that it's much less linear than that. And what I really tried to do throughout my career in terms of looking at this technology, and especially looking at the Navy, is trying to determine how it was integrated into this culture of the Navy, and it was complex and very difficult to do. As far as World War I is concerned, I want to have a disclaimer here. Jeff Rossano has an excellent book on American naval aviation overseas in World War I. It's called Stalking the U-Boat. And anything I know about naval aviation overseas in World War I came from Jeff Rossano's book. What I've done as far as World War I in particular is much more limited. I've done a history of the Naval Aircraft Factory, which had its origins at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in World War I. As Bill pointed out here, I did a biography of Jerome Hunsaker, who essentially was in charge of naval aviation in Washington during World War I. I also did a biography of William A. Moffett, who was commandant of the Great Lakes Naval Training Station during World War I, and began to be associated with naval aviation and the training elements of it. And then most recently, I've worked on Glenn Curtiss in the very early years of naval aviation. And Curtiss and his company carried through World War I and were major manufacturers for naval aircraft during the war. So I'm going to back up a little bit and look at the very early years related to Glenn Curtiss. You probably couldn't find anybody who would be more unlikely to be involved in naval aviation than Glenn Curtiss. There was no military or Navy background in his family. He hailed from Hammondsport, New York, in the upstate Finger Lakes region of New York. That's about as far from saltwater as you're going to get. But he was instrumental in the emergence of early naval aviation. I like to think about this as a partnership, and we talked about that also in relation to civil and military relations. Very early on, in 1910 in particular, he hooked up with Captain Washington Irving Chambers. Chambers was responsible, just initially, for handling aviation correspondence in the Office of the Secretary of the Navy, but saw some opportunities here for this new technology. And he was casting around for somebody to work with him. The Wright brothers were busy. They were working with the Army. So they didn't have time. They said, we'd like to work with you, but they didn't really have time to be able to do that because of their other commitments. The other person who's left was Glenn Curtiss. So in the fall of 1910, Curtiss and Chambers got to know each other, got to work together, and ultimately worked out a series of experiments that were extremely important here for demonstrating what the airplane could do at sea. Now, the ones you're most familiar with are the ones that Curtiss aviator Eugene Ely flew in November of 1910 at Hampton Roads, flying from the cruiser Birmingham, flying off a platform over the bow of the cruiser Birmingham. And then later in January of 1911, remember this is the centennial, on the West Coast in San Francisco, landing on a platform over the stern of the armored cruiser Pennsylvania, and then turning around and taking off. And what you see here looks very much like the aircraft carrier. The evolution that Ely was responsible for, in many ways looked like carrier operations. But it was more or less a stunt. Ely knew it, Curtiss knew it, even Chambers knew it, how dangerous a stunt this was. I want to point out another flight that some people tend to forget about. This was late January of 1911. And this was J.A.D. McCurdy. McCurdy was one of the Curtiss aviators, one of the exhibition flyers for the Curtiss exhibition team in 1910 and 1911. And he flew from Key West almost all the way to Havana, Cuba. Just about 90 miles he flew from Key West to about 4 miles offshore of Cuba. This was the longest overwater flight that anybody had made up to that point. He had to land in the water. He had some flotation gear. But what that demonstrated to people was that maybe there was some way that you could be able to operate aircraft from the water. Take off from the water, land on the water, and carry out more or less routine operations from ships at sea. This resonated with Chambers. This resonated with Curtiss as well. Chambers in particular was not a fan of having a dedicated aviation ship. In other words, he really wasn't thinking about an aircraft carrier at that time. What he was thinking about was airplanes that could routinely operate from most of the ships in the fleet. And that meant they had to be able to land on and take off from water. They had to have some kind of flotation arrangement. And working with Curtiss, that led to the development of what was known as the hydro airplane in 1911. More or less doing the work at Hammondsport and also at North Island and San Diego. Some of you people may be familiar with North Island and Naval Aviation. That really demonstrated what could be done in terms of operating aircraft from the water. He followed that in fact, the first airplanes that were acquired by the Navy in 1911 were hydro airplanes. The A-1 was a hydro airplane. He followed that, Curtiss followed that, again, working with the Navy and working with Chambers, with the flying boat in 1912. Here you have an integrated hull that provides both the aerodynamic structure of the craft, but also the hydrodynamics of it, bringing them all together in that combination. And again, hard work was done here to bring the flying boat to fruition by the summer of 1912. And finally, one other point that's very significant as far as early naval aviation was concerned was training. And what Curtiss had, and Chambers had this idea as well, was that it could become self-perpetuating. For example, Curtiss trained the first naval aviator, Theodore Ellison. But the idea was that Ellison then would train the next naval aviator, actually it was three, that was John Towers. And then subsequently they would train each other. And it was really very much Curtiss's idea and Chambers' idea in this partnership to establish training of the first naval aviators. I want to also talk here briefly about World War I, and I'm going to watch my time here and have to summarize some of this. There were some basic issues here involving naval aviation in World War I, and people were aware of this in the United States in 1914. Remember, the war started in August of 1914. People were aware of this in the United States as early as August 1914. There was a sense that we were going to be engaged in this war at some point. So what do you have to do? Well, first of all, they had to define aircraft requirements. What does the Navy need? What kinds of aircraft What types of aircraft? How many of these airplanes are they going to need? Well, who are going to be the manufacturers? How are you going to carry out the bidding process? How are you going to write up contracts and specifications? What about profits? How much profit should be out there for manufacturers of airplanes? What about materials and materials deliveries, supply flows? All of these things people had to think about. Inspection of the final product was something that was necessary as well. And then finally, you have to deliver the product. You have to deliver the aircraft to the fleet. Does any of this sound familiar to people who might be going into acquisition and into aircraft procurement or any other kind of procurement within the Navy? There were a lot of decisions that had to be made, and they had to be made fairly quickly in 1914 and on through the next couple of years before the United States was involved in the war. One of the first decisions was made before the end of 1914, and this was an agreement between the Bureau of Construction and Repair, and remember, you've got to understand the bureau system here within the Navy and the divided responsibilities. This was a decision made by the Bureau of Construction and Repair and the Bureau of Steam Engineering, later the Bureau of Engineering. They were responsible for aircraft engines. The Bureau of Construction and Repair was responsible for airframes. They had to make a decision about what they wanted and what the Navy was going to need as it moved forward toward ultimately involvement in World War I. They recognized immediately that the manufacturing and the available manufacturers was going to be limited. So they were only going to be able to work with a limited number of aircraft manufacturers out there. They also knew they were going to have to work with Curtiss. They decided as well that they were going to focus on production aircraft. They weren't going to do a lot of experimentation. They recognized that they would have to develop standard types that were going to be used if they were going to be able to have large numbers of these. That was followed in March of 1915 with the Naval Appropriation Act of that month and that year. And what that did was to appropriate, now get this, $1 million for the acquisition of naval aircraft. You go say $1 million, right? But in March of 1915, that was real money. And to be able to provide $1 million for aircraft manufacturing and procurement was unbelievable to people at that time. What are we going to do with all this money? How are we going to spend this money, and what are we going to get for it? In April 1917, the United States came into World War I, and something called the Joint Army-Navy Technical Board made a decision that between 1918 and 1919, and generally speaking, people thought that this war would go through 1918 and well into 1919, that there would have to be 12,000 military aircraft procured. 12,000 of these aircraft. So we're not talking about scores of aircraft now. We're not talking about hundreds of aircraft. We're talking about thousands of aircraft. Something else was going on here as well into the summer of 1917, and that was also related to the kinds of aircraft that the United States Navy was going to have. Much of this was driven by foreign demands. The mission that went to France in August of 1917, headed by Reynold Bolling, came back and said that the French, the British, our allies in Europe need literally thousands of aircraft. And it was virtually impossible for the United States industry at that time to provide more than a third of the aircraft that were needed. So we're talking about an entirely different scale here of operations and production that people were going to be responsible for. The Navy made a decision into the fall and then late 1917 that it would focus on flying boats. What they wanted were twin-engine, long-range, large aircraft that would be primarily used for anti-submarine warfare. What was the big problem in 1917? The big problem was getting goods overseas. The big problem was the U-boat. And the focus here was on patrol aircraft that could locate and ultimately attack U-boats in anti-submarine warfare. So where were the manufacturers? Well, pretty much the only private manufacturer out there who had the capability and capacity to provide these kinds of aircraft, especially large flying boats, was the Curtiss Company. And of course, Curtiss had already had this establishment, this partnership with the Navy for some time, going back to 1910. Curtiss in 1915 began to expand tremendously as a result of foreign orders. In fact, could barely keep up with those foreign orders at this time, both for small trainer aircraft, but also for large flying boats as well, primarily going to Britain, but some of them also went to Russia in 1915. Curtiss also recognized during this time that it was impossible to be able to provide that kind of output in the factory that he had established in Hammondsport, New York. So he moved not too far away, about 100 miles away, to Buffalo and established a very large manufacturing establishment there in late 1914 and on into 1915. Here also there were some problems that arose as a consequence of the scale of this manufacturing. Curtiss had come up and been familiar with essentially a small shop culture, where he worked individually on designs, worked individually on the construction of aircraft. Well, that's not going to work with literally thousands of airplanes that have to be constructed. And the Navy was very much understanding of this situation in 1917 especially. And there's correspondence out there where the Navy is going to Curtiss and saying, you had better change how you are handling the production and manufacturing of airplanes and essentially beef up your engineering structure in Buffalo. And Curtiss, to his credit, recognized that. He recognized his own limitations as far as that was concerned and did more or less turn his engineering staff over to more professionals. Another interesting thing that happened was in late 1917 and on into early 1918, when he was more or less pushed aside by Wall Street interests into essentially a figurehead position at his own company, he set up what was known as the Curtiss Engineering Corporation in Garden City, Long Island, which functioned as a research and development institution, not only for the Curtiss company, but also for the Navy. Again, continuing that partnership that had been established. The war in Washington had to be fought, and there primarily it was fought by Lieutenant Commander and later Commander Jerome C. Hunsaker. In July 1916, Jerome Hunsaker took over the aircraft division in the Bureau of Construction and Repair. And there he was primarily responsible for organizing, administering, and essentially ensuring the efficiency of aircraft manufacturing for the Navy. The aircraft division expanded exponentially in 1917 and 1918. And in fact, Hunsaker had a tough time in Washington just trying to find office space for his people. Many civilian engineers came in as a consequence of this. And he also had to set up an apparatus at the factories themselves. And what Hunsaker did was to establish what's known as the Superintending Constructor of Aircraft. And these were essentially naval officers, engineering officers, who were posted to each one of these aircraft manufacturing facilities to look at what was going on there, to oversee it, to make sure the specifications were being met by the manufacturer, and to provide liaison with people in Washington who were in charge of this. And as you might suspect, there were all kinds of problems involved with this during the war. For example, competitive bidding. Hunsaker recognized that if you're going to have strict competitive bidding, it was going to slow everything down. You were never going to be able to go through this process of acquiring the numbers of aircraft that you needed if you're going to be involved strictly with competitive bidding. And as a consequence of that, they kind of got around this by saying certain proprietary articles, certain proprietary airplanes would be exempt from the competitive bidding process. The scale of this was monumental. Hunsaker, for example, set forward what he called his 1700 program, with about 2/3 of those airplanes being large flying boats, the other third largely being smaller trainers. But again, 1,700 aircraft that were going to be produced literally in less than a year in 1918 was a monumental challenge for everybody in the Navy. The Navy also had what it referred to as special requirements. Flying from the sea is different than flying from the land. And the Navy also recognized that it wasn't going to need as many airplanes as the Army needed. Not only would those airplanes have to be specialized, but they wouldn't need quite as many. And as a consequence of this, there was established the Naval Aircraft Factory at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in 1917. And the idea here was to provide the Navy with its own manufacturing facility. It could meet those special requirements. And it also provided an opportunity for hands-on experience by people involved in naval aviation and especially in aeronautical engineering. Once more, the Naval Aircraft Factory faced major challenges here with the expansion of aviation during the war. Initially, they were talking about producing about 1,000 trainers over about a 2-year period. That rapidly changed. In 1918, in June of 1918, the Secretary of the Navy determined that there would be an additional 700 flying boats, large flying boats that would be constructed. Admiral William S. Sims, who was overseas in charge of American naval aviation, more or less doubled that. So you're going from 1,000 small aircraft to perhaps more than 1,000, maybe even 2,000 large twin-engine flying boats. What the Naval Aircraft Factory did, and this was important in terms of the structure of later manufacturing, they recognized that they were not going to be able to do all of that in-house. So what they managed to do was to set up elaborate subcontracting systems where they would go out to subcontractors to produce parts of these flying boats, transport them to Philadelphia, and then carry out final assembly there. This very much speeded up the process for manufacturing airplanes during the war. The record for the United States Navy during the war as far as aircraft production was concerned was impressive. It was much better than the Army's record during the war. And it's particularly impressive when they started off with something like 50 airplanes in the inventory in 1914 to having literally thousands of airplanes that were available to the Navy by the end of 1918 and the end of the war. Some of the problems that they encountered were material shortages. A lot of wood had to be acquired to go into these airplanes, and various alternative materials had to be come up with as a consequence of that. There were delivery bottlenecks. A lot of these aircraft had to be crated. They were broken down, crated, and then they had to be shipped overseas, primarily through East Coast ports. That became a major headache for Hunsaker and other people in Washington. And then also there were defects in delivery. And Jeff Rossano points that out in his book in particular, which meant also that people like Hunsaker had to send people overseas to be in France, to be in Britain, to make sure that these aircraft were assembled properly. Just to give you an idea again of the scale of this, by 1919, the early part of 1919, after the war was over, the Curtiss Company had 18,000 workers in various factories. And they produced something on the order of, I'm going to try to add all these things up, something on the order of 1,200 airplanes of various kinds by the early part of 1919. The Naval Aircraft Factory had nearly 3,700 workers and produced something like 250 airplanes of various sizes, mostly large flying boats during the war. One other point here, too, is that women came into the aircraft industry in large numbers during World War I. You think of Rosie the Riveter and World War II, right? But large numbers of women came into the aircraft industry in World War I. About a third of the workforce at the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia were women. And I'd be willing to bet that something like that was the equivalent in other manufacturing facilities during the war as well. Not Rosie the Riveter as much as Sally Seamstress, because a lot of this was fabric, not only sewing fabric, but also preparing that fabric for installation in aircraft at that time. As far as operations overseas are concerned, again, I do have to defer to Jeff Rossano, and I urge you to take a look at his book. It's really a marvelous study of what was going on overseas during World War I. Again, this is pretty much starting from nothing in 1917 and having a major overseas establishment by 1919. For example, the Navy set up 27 naval air stations overseas in what, 3 countries, maybe even 4 countries if you want to add Ireland to this. 400 airplanes were delivered overseas, and more than 19,000 officers and men finally found their way overseas during the war. These flying boats in particular on anti-submarine warfare duty flew more than 1 million miles during the war. In addition to this, what the Navy was preparing to do for the 1919 offensive was something known as the Northern Bombing Group. What this was really a strategic bombing offensive that the Navy was planning for that would involve something on the order of 350 bombers and upwards of 7,000 officers or men. And again, one more statistic. During the war, more than 37,000 officers and men went into naval aviation. And if you go back to 1911, how many officers and men were there in naval aviation at that time? If you count chambers, you're going to have maybe 5, up to more than 37,000. Significance of all this, aviation became a part of the Navy. Aviation was integrated into the Navy during this period, from 1910, 1911, to the end of 1918. And this is something that also concerns me in many ways. Some historians and some authors refer to, in the Navy, an entity known as the Gun Club. And this has always puzzled me. At this time in the teens, for example, in the 19-teens, referring to a gun club in the Navy seems to me to be a tautology. Everybody knows what a tautology is. Come on, folks, you're in the Navy, right? What are you talking about? You're talking about guns, right? So to identify a particular part of the Navy or particular officers of the Navy as part of this gun club has always puzzled me. These were people who knew about battleships. These were people who knew about big guns. But they also knew about this new technology. They also understood about aviation. And their primary concern was how they can make this work in the fleet, how they can use this as a new weapon. They're, of course, thinking that this is going to augment the battleship. They're not saying this is going to supplant the battleship, but they're not opposed to it. They want to see this come into the Navy and be used in a constructive way. The experience of World War I carried over into the interwar years. Much of the experience that people had in the Navy in World War I as junior officers carried over to them as senior officers in World War II. That doesn't mean that there wasn't considerable uncertainty about the future. That doesn't mean that people still weren't concerned about, for example, what the aircraft carrier could do as an independent striking force within the fleet. And all of this then came together as a consequence of the efforts that were made in World War I. All of this coalesced in World War I and carried over into the interwar years and into World War II in particular. And you might as well start getting familiar with World War I because we have a centennial of World War I coming up sooner rather than later. And I bet there'll be some other meetings like this, conferences like this, where people are going to be talking about naval aviation in World War I. So there's an overview. Thank you very much. And I think we still have some time for questions, I hope, and I'll try to do what I can do. We all right? We got, okay, no time for questions. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Trimble, and I think it's appropriate that we present you with one of our Centennial of Naval Aviation books from the Naval Institute Press, 100 Years of the U.S. Navy Air Power. We're very grateful. Thank you.
That's Doug Smith's work.
It is. Thank you.